Hey everybody, welcome to Oregon State University's Permaculture Design Pro class. This is the office hours for the fall and winter class, and or winter and spring class actually. And we're looking at our office hour number 2. Great to see everybody here. Nice to see everybody's faces. We're going to go through the questions as usual in the Q&A doc. And I've got a few announcements to start us off with. And nice to see a bit of the chat coming in. Folks are talking about the course. So far, Sheena's saying, loving everything so far. I'm seeing my design site through new eyes. Yeah, we like to call those the permaculture goggles or the permaculture lens. Especially when we get into water, you start seeing opportunities to harvest water everywhere, just opportunities everywhere. So that's great. Corey, hey everyone, I'm really enjoying seeing all your sites. Kendra, really enjoying it. Eye-opening on how much growth and opportunity still to learn. Yeah, totally. And Jimmy, I've had a hard time engaging fully due to wrapping up landscape and farm work. We're hoping to really get into it coming week. Yeah, and that's a big part of it. There's a lot to do. So if those of us are working on sites, there's a lot to, of course, add on with the course. So try to find time to slate it in and keep it alive on a daily basis, and then larger chunks works out really well. So like a 2 or 3 hour deep work session per week can be super helpful. Okay, so I'm gonna pull up the questions here and a couple of announcements. So one of the things that I've been noticing that a few folks haven't been doing, if you've been doing this, thank you so much, is you'll need to link to the slide that begins this week's assignment. So if we're in the template and let's say we're coming into week 2 and we're gonna start to put up our base maps, then what you'll wanna do is go to the title slide for the base map like this. Make sure that your sharing functions are correct so that people can view and whatnot. And then you're going to want to triple click this URL, copy that, and then put it into the link that you link your site to. And that'll help me go directly to the information that's necessary for this week and jump right into the conversation. So I'm gonna slim myself down just to my screen. There we go. So that's one of the first things to keep note of. So north is usually up in our maps. There may be good reason for real estate in terms of the slides to augment or to turn your site. But if it can fit, with north being up, I recommend that to be so, only because if you're in the northern hemisphere, the south is where the sun's going to be coming from. And so it's easier to orient yourself to your site and to start to become aware and to work with solar real estate when you're working on your design site, because you have to think of, from here on out, you kind of have to think of water as fuel and the sun as the throttle. And so when we're designing, especially plant placement, hedgerows, production orchards, annual gardens, arboretums, you name it, we're trying to optimize for solar real estate. And if our site is a little jogged on our paper, it could be harder and harder to wrap our brains around that. Of course, if we're in the southern hemisphere, the sun is in the north, and thus we have the same conversation. But if we start to change even by 10 degrees or 20 degrees, it's a little bit harder for our brains to wrap around. So generally, I recommend keeping north up. A couple of folks have already asked this question. If your site is large or a different shape, then it'll be important to use callouts or detailed maps of each section. So I worked with a client 2-3 years ago, and they had 300 meter by 20 meter site. And it didn't make sense to put it on a map. So we cut it up into 4 or 5 sections, and then we worked on each section. But they had both their main base map and then they had their callouts. And those callouts, those details, were there to allow us to really zero in on different aspects of it. Because as we work with maps, doesn't matter how much paper or how big it is, there will be a size constraint that if we get to a certain level, it's going to be problematic to work with. Years ago, I used to work on a 3 foot by 2 foot piece of paper and big clipboard that I would take out to the sites, and then I moved to 2 feet. And then I finally moved to 11 by 17 inches because it was easy to put on a clipboard. You could buy paper for it. You could buy a printer scanner for it. And then all of a sudden it made sense. Then I moved completely digitally. So I worked on an iPad and worked online. And then I would still print things at 11 by 17 only because I worked and lived in Canada for a very long time, and that was the sizing of paper that was all there. Even though Canadian is metric, Canada's metric, there's a lot of things that are still done in inches. So that was a good process. For those that haven't explored it or haven't taken a look at some of the tutorials where I go into Google Earth Pro, it's a great tool to use for larger scale design and can help to inform a design and actually keep up-to-date information, especially because you have the ability to have clients access data on site and actually upload it to Google Earth Pro and share those types of folders. So working with iOS, excuse me for a second. Noah, hey. My dog has decided to take issue with something outside. So if you're using with Google Earth Pro, you can have client applications where they can gather information. The one that we used for iOS was GPS Kit, and the one that I'm currently using for Android is called Gaia GPS. And in that, clients are able to take photos from different areas if they have geolocation turned on, and then you can import those photos directly into Google Earth Pro. And if you have different dates where they're checking in with their site, it's amazing because you can start to see references being made on that site from different seasons, from different changes. If you start to do implementation for plant systems or for earthworks, you can start to see things change over time. So it can be a great tool in your toolbox. Lastly, there's a couple of great courses coming up that you may be interested in. We've got a course coming up in January, and we're just about to launch the course. So anybody on the pre-launch, anybody on these pre-launch lists will have access to a better price. They'll get into the material earlier, a whole bunch of hosts of benefits. So Coppice Agroforestry is using trees in a way that we used to before the advent of coal. Basically, we were in what was called the pole wood economy. And the pole wood economy was we would grow trees to the size that we needed them because it took a lot of energy to cut them into dimensional lumber, to cut them into different areas. So Coppice Agroforestry is a North American English focused course on Coppice Agroforestry. There's a lot of Coppice Agroforestry information out there for Europe because it's a tradition that dates back millennia. But with this, we have our very first English course, and it coincides with Mark's new book, Coppice Agroforestry, as well. That'll happen in January of 2023. So if you're interested, click on the pre-launch list there. The other course, which we ran last year, which is phenomenal, if you're dealing in places that are dealing with erosion, habitat disruption, forest fires or the results of forest fires, or anything where water is actively eroding landscape and unzipping a landscape. Low-tech erosion control is a brilliant course put on by Jeffrey Adams and Neil Bertrando, where they teach you how to save the world with rocks, stones, and other types of material by basically pacifying, calming water and distributing it out upon a landscape. We ran this course last year, and we're currently looking at running it in 2023. And finally, Rainwater Harvesting with Gord Baird is a phenomenal course. Gord is a pivotal individual in British Columbia. He has the distinction of helping to create the precedent for the first composting toilets and gray water ready regulations put into building code in the world. Within British Columbia, we have a composting toilets course right now that's running with him. We'll probably be taking a look at doing a gray water course as well. So if you're interested in any of those, feel free to sign up on those pre-launch lists and you'll be notified when they are live. Cool. Just seeing that there's a chat here. Oh, great. And Jimmy's sharing the nativeland.ca website, which is a great website to understand for those who are living in Canada, where what the ancestral lands or the current territories are of the First Nations in the area. Great link there, Jimmy. Thanks so much. Okay, let's jump in. We have a lot of questions. Thank you so much for putting them in. And thanks so much for putting them in early. This is a very important aspect of this for me because it allows me to precog the questions to come to tighter and tighter answers and really help make sure that we get all the information that's necessary out to folks as it happens. And as folks have already done, there are a few folks who can't make this, but ask the question anyways, and I'm able to answer it, and they're able to take a look at this after the fact. So anybody can do that as well. So for Michael from Seoul, Korea, for the soil assignment, are there suggested locations we should perform the jar test and the drain test? Do we just choose anywhere with easy access on the site, or should we choose carefully? So yes, choose carefully. Choose where you'd like to develop plantings on the soil, so that way you can be clear of any amendments or the watering regimes, but also if you're curious if there's been changes in the site. So for a lot of people that have seen visual signs of disruption in their site, or if they've been seeing an area that's pooling water, or an area that generally looks like it's suffering, or it doesn't produce as much vegetation as other parts of their landscape, those are good places to choose. You'll find that as you get to that soil assignment, and many folks are looking ahead, which is brilliant, because once you get to the soil assignment, you're going to be in some places in the Northern Hemisphere, you're going to be in the dead of winter. And so it's a good idea to look ahead and start to do some of those assignments first, especially in terms of choosing. So your choices in terms of where those soil samples should be or would be, any place you're thinking of developing, any place you're thinking of growing, any place that looks like there's been changes, or any place that looks like it's been suffering through either vegetative cues or soil cues. Second question from Michael. I'm planning on adding an extension to my house, which lies in the center of the site. The construction should end around January. I won't have any satellite images until next year when Google Satellites makes its snapshot. Should I just use blueprints made by my architect for assignments when I need satellite images? Yep, great idea. Now, you could put it in such a way where it's whatever color you're using for buildings, there's a dotted line of that same color to say, and with a little addendum or a little caveat that says, this is the extension, this is what will be, and I know it will be here, so I'm going to add it in, and that's totally fine. His third question for slope terrain, and I'm just going to indent these so our numbering system still makes sense. For slope terrain, is distance always measured on the ground? Do we have to compensate the distance measured when we are basing our scales off satellite images? So this is a question I had when I started. If you look at the slope, the distance is actually longer. So would that change something to do with measurement? Well, the cool thing is that if you think of like a raindrop just sees the outline of your roof. It doesn't actually see the full distance that roof travels. It doesn't care. It just sees that bird's eye view. So no, you don't have to take that into account in any way, shape, or form when you're working on your base maps. There are other areas where you may need to, but that's fine. So for Kendra, from Michigan, which soil test should be running on our sites? pH, chloride, or sulfates, etc. When I kept up my samples Friday and I want to send them out this week. So it's a great question. And Kendra and I are going into specifics here, but I want to broadly answer the question, and then we'll go into her specifics. So when we're taking a look at soil tests, there's a couple of reasons to do a soil test, and there's a couple of reasons to do different types of soil tests. First and foremost, one of the reasons to do a soil test, especially if you're going to be on the site for a long time, is to get baseline data. So this baseline data can give you a sense of what is the organic matter in your material soil, what is the soil texture, which we teach you how to test via the shake jar test, which is less accurate than the ribbon test. It'll give you a sense potentially of what is your mineral and elemental composition of your soil. And if you want, you can then get things like pH. You can do specific tests for specific types of elements or heavy metals or even agrochemicals. And then you can move on to the entire soil food web testing. Now, the soil food web testing is a biological test that gives you a sense, first and foremost, of your fungal and bacterial ratio, which gives you a sense of generally where your site is in terms of succession. So generally in succession, when we start with disturbance, we're going back down to usually our grasses, our forbs, our pioneers, our prickly, our poisonous, our pernicious plants. And generally it's a very high bacteria, very low fungal. And as we move into more woody, deciduous, coniferous, we tend to get higher fungals and lower bacterials. Then you can do full counts on both your protozoas, your nematodes, your microarthropods. You can do a number of different counts depending on the level and the amount of budget you have. But generally, that fungal to bacterial ratio will be enough in terms of your living soil test, unless you are specifically working on a crop, and that crop is a cash crop. So let's say you're working on grapes or cannabis or corn or anything really that's a large scale crop that is, 30, 25% of the site's income. Then all of a sudden you may want to get more specific, because then you can start to craft compost extracts and teas that are aerated specifically for that site to help balance out or increase a population within the soil food web, as well as the diversity of that as well. And we'll get into that more as we get to the soil. So when Kendra asked me this question, I said, depends, what are your site goals pertaining to soil? And she said, hay production, tree planting, slow water down, passing through property. My site is a horse property discussed during the other classes off hours last week. No problems, Kendra. It was a pleasure to have you there. You were the only one who asked a question, so it was all good. Soil is roughly 10 to 12 inches of soil followed by very granular sand. My main reason for the question is my husband is a lab manager for a soils management and engineering company, and will be sending out my soil test for me, and want to know exactly what test he would run. So yeah, it sounds like budget may not be a consideration. So in that case, I would definitely do texture. I would do an organic matter. I may even do a respiration test. That just gives you a higher degree of certainty about carbon. And then from there, I'd probably do a full mineral assay. And if you have worry about overland contamination from agricultural runoff from your neighbors, then I would specifically target whatever those runoffs might be. So if that's glyphosate, if that's something like chlorides or chloramines, if you do know that there's a water filtration plant nearby. I tend not to care about pH, only because pH can change in the exact same location over a 24-hour period up to 2 points, which is wild. And unless you're testing in the same place, in the same location, at the same time, at the same point of year, that's really how you start to control pH testing over variables, because it can change so wildly. And this is because plants within their rhizosphere, which is a couple of millimeters around the root, are changing their exudates, which is the carbohydrates they cleave off of CO2 through the process of photosynthesis. And then they take those carbohydrates, take them into long chain, exudate them through their roots, give them a certain charge, so that way they attract certain types of fungi or bacteria, so that way they can bring towards them the deficits that they're working on. Because that all happens all the time, there's always a change in pH all the time, and can wildly vary up to 2 points either way. And this was confirmed time and time again by Elaine Ingham's work, Dr. Elaine Ingham's work at the Soil Food Web. So I don't worry about pH. If you want it just to have as a number, that's great, but I would not use it to do any large scale amendments. Definitely no dolomitic lime. This whole idea of dolomitic lime is really brutal on soils. You can chemically compact your soils through dolomitic lime. I do not recommend it, and do not recommend really any sort of amendment off of pH outside of compost or aerated compost extracts or teas. And even then, you want to know what's in them. So I said, are there any contaminations possibilities? And she said, possibly after taking the soil samples and completing the perc test, I feel the water is running right under the property for the most part, since there's rarely any standing water, even across heavy rains. So I began to expand the aerial view of my site, looking to watershed already across the highway south of the property. There are a few traditionally farmed fields. I'm looking to the process currently to see if that is a threat. Yeah, so that's a great thought. And generally, when I'm doing property assessment, I'm taking a look at the largest watershed possible to see what the potential contaminants or what potential cumulative water flow will be onto a property. And that becomes very important, because the amount of water that's running onto your land then becomes a potential number to work with for what can we capture and store on land. So I said, if you have concern about contamination, I would conduct a full soil test and potentially test for agrochemicals. A&L laboratories are excellent for this type of testing. Their turnaround is great. Their pricing is great. They do fungal to bacterial ratios. They will do specific testing. They do vegetative testing. So if you're working with vegetation and you're worried about its contamination, you can set in vegetation for testing as well. Next question. Oh, Kendra, let's check in with you first. Does that answer the question? Any follow-ups to that?
No, I think we got it all.
Okay, sounds good.
It was a lot. I'm like, this is getting wordy.
That's all good. It's all good. Okay, let's jump into the next one. Would it benefit to complete a perc test in multiple areas of the site? Site is 24.3 acres. So I would do the soil assessment soon because obviously that's where you're at, and look at the NRCS soil areas for your site. If it were me, I would test different areas of the ground, areas to ground truth the data you found online and see if any area was thicker of cultivating. So what you were saying up here, excuse me, which I think I missed, is you got 10 to 12 inches of topsoil followed by very granular sand. So yeah, you would have high drainage. Basically the rainfall, the overland water that would come into your site would basically get to the point of what's called field capacity in your topsoil. Field capacity is where, so soil is built up of what's called soil PEDs, P-E-D-E, and sometimes PED, depending on who's spelling it. And those PEDs are made up of sand, silt, and clay, plus organic matter. And so fungi, of course, is the threads that can hold soil together. Bacteria is like the glue that can hold a PED together. And when you grab really nice soil and it's cakey, you know, it's clumping together, that's what we call a soil PED. Now, when water moves through soil, through two forces, under capillary action, adhesion and cohesion, water adding itself to something else, cohesion, water connecting itself or being community with itself. These two forces, which we call capillary action, then hold water around a soil PED through surface area. Now, at field capacity, that water is completely around that PED, but there is still what's called interstitial airspace, or just airspace, air pockets in between, which is good because the soil food web is terrestrial and the life within the soil needs air. It needs to breathe. Once we move past field capacity, we move into saturation, where those air spaces are now filled with water. And now gravity is strong enough to pull some of that water away from the capillary action. Capillary action is stronger than gravity. And that water then will move below the topsoil and into the granular sand and drain away. So this means that really the only thing you can do if you're trying to increase water holding capacity is build more soil or increase the water holding capacity, WHC, of your soil. So in terms of your site, you definitely could do the perc test in multiple areas if you were thinking about that and worried about that. But it seems like that when I'm taking a look at what you're saying here, so I completed the perc test 3 different areas. They were all free draining after saturation, which is almost 30 gal per hole, which is a lot in a short amount of time. It's 25 to 30 minutes. Can't be 100% sure, but looking at the soil survey for the city, it stated the perc rate should be extremely slow for the area, where my site is proven to be quite opposite. What could be causing this discrepancy? Something to do with the traditional farming methods. So basically, when we take a look at what plowing does, plowing conventionally is an inversion plow. And so basically what happens is the soil gets flipped, it gets turned. And what happens in that is that the soil food web dies out and there's all this food available for plants right off the bat. You got fungal die-off, you got bacterial die-off, you got microarthropod die-off, protozoa die-off, and nematode die-off, and plus the upper levels of that trophic levels, earthworms, other types of arthropods, things like that. So that means there's a lot of material for plants to suck up and eat. But the problem is that you're taking out of that incredible, intricate ecology that is producing all of the fertility to start off with. Elaine Ingham famously says in an acre of corn, there's enough potassium for that corn in a grain of sand. The problem is unlocking it and distributing it over that acre of corn. So once we have a plow that comes in, or if we have uniform cutting of plants, not necessarily grazing, which of course sloughs off a little bit of material, there's still vegetative material left, that plant's still photosynthesizing, carbohydrates are still released, soil food web's still eating, more carbon is produced, all of that chain reaction. So what'll happen is when you have that inversion, you have that plowing, you have that disturbance, you lose that organic matter, you lose the organic living biology, and all of that starts to degrade. And over time, you end up with sand because all of that material gets removed. Or if you're in heavy clay, you'll end up with purely heavy clay, but usually we're not doing agriculture in those heavy clay areas and not getting that productive yield because it's too hard to pull a plow through. So that's usually worked with hand, or we usually see some sort of indentured servitude being used for agricultural labor in that way. So generally what I'm thinking is that it's possible that the soil survey wasn't correctly created originally, but it's unlikely. So it's probably due to plowing, probably due to haying. And usually with plowing over time, you'll get what's called hard pan, because you'll get an area that becomes compacted below the tine of the plow. So your next question was, what could be some methods to reverse the damage? I know we've discussed implementing trees on contour. Yeah. So generally what we have to start doing is we have to start thinking ecologically about our soils. And this is largely what regenerative agriculture is talking about, biodynamics is talking about, Korean natural farming, permaculture, regenerative agriculture, you name it. Basically, there's a couple of tenets. First and foremost, keep living plants in the soil as long as possible. This is where we get back to what we talked about last week with your site, is Colin Seiss's pasture cropping, really keeping a diverse array of different types of plants that are alive during the season. We have C3, C4 grasses, things that are producing all throughout the season. So that way that field doesn't become a monocrop of hay and only hay. Because the number one way to decrease a site is to keep it bare, but the next is to monocrop it, because you just don't have the diversity in the array. So a lot of what we were talking about last week, the swales on contour, the tree systems below that, the hedgerows, starting to work with pasture cropping, starting to work with mob stock grazing. So if there's only horses on there, making sure they're on an area for a short amount of time, moving them off of that. So that way they don't denude that landscape. And grazers are the same the world over. They go for what they like first. They go for the ice cream first, and then they move down everything else in that pasture until they get to the things they don't like. They move off that pasture, and because everything else is denuded, the things they don't like, the pioneers, the prickly, the poisonous, the pernicious, persist, and they become prolific. So, when you come to a site that's only got thistle on it, well, it's been overgrazed almost without question, overgrazed or overtilled or overhayed. So generally starting to work in on those edges. Obviously you still need to produce hay on that landscape. So starting to be a bit more conscientious about how you're doing it, and really starting to diversify what you have on that landscape would be important. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Question 4, when looking at a watershed, where are some places we can find the best information? I'm trying to get an idea on better water flow on the property where it's standing water. Okay, so I said, take a look at how to find contours or topographical information. And Michael asked about it as well. And so I put the link down here. This is found under base maps, slide 22. It's the last one on the first column, finding accurate topographic information. And so finding accurate topographic information, I'm not going to go through it again because I'm just going to say what I said and it's already in the video. Takes a little bit of looking, takes a little bit of finding. If you don't find it, you can start to do drone surveys and things of that nature on your site, which would be easy to do for you because it's open canopy. Closed canopy becomes very difficult to do drone photogrammetry survey, which is basically you're flying a drone over top using a third-party software like Drone Deploy, Maps Made Easy, something like that. And through photogrammetry, which is knowing where the drone started with, where it was in the sky, and where it is in position and relationship to the ground, it through geometry and trigonometry can get a sense of the elevation of the surface of your site to about an 8 to 10 centimeter accuracy, which is brilliant for what it is. So take a look at what I'm talking about in that video. I go through it step by step. If you have any more questions, let me know. All right, Kendra, how do we do? Any further questions, follow-up questions, things of that nature?
Nope. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Awesome. Ben asked the question, can you share a link to the example of a large base map with the callouts? Yeah, it'll take me a while to find. So Ben, if you want to just put that down as a question at the bottom of our section here, after I finish, I will find a couple examples. I know there's some in the template over to the right-hand side in this first previous student examples list that I just made. I just offhand, I don't know which one. So if you can just put that down at the bottom of this list here. That'll help to remind me. Thanks so much for that. Rudo, awesome. So Rudo's not here, but I will answer this question. Rudo, my site is on virgin land, but I have plans that have already been drawn up for the building sites. For my base map, can I put in buildings that I'm sure are going to be built, i.e. cottage, servants' quarters, chicken coop, and I'm only and make only a permaculture design around those buildings, or do I need to only work with what's on the ground currently? So if it were I would only include what is currently on site. Now this goes against what Michael asked me about the extension. But the reason I say this is that you may come across something in the conversation as you're assessing the land that will change where you're going to put the buildings. And this is very true when it comes to access, fire damage, wind, and potential solar access. And for somebody who's in Zimbabwe, making sure that your buildings can be cool may or may not change where you place them when we're starting to talk about the cooling effect of the ponds. So there may be a spot on site. This is why we use the scale of permanence for, or scale of agriculture for all things. What? Scale of permanence for all things agricultural, created by P.A. Yeomans. There we go. The wires got crossed there for a second. This is why we use that scale, because we start with climate, then we go to topography, then we go to water. Notice we haven't gotten to buildings yet. Then we go to access. Notice how we haven't gotten to any, like, we still haven't gotten to the buildings, and yet people are obsessed with the buildings. So when we start to take a look at a landscape and decode it and really start to see where water flows, now all of a sudden, because water is life, water is the limiting factor for pretty much everybody's site. For those of you in very humid sites near water, I'm not talking about you, but for the majority of people the world over, we have de-watered or dehydrated our landscape, and it's one of the major issues. It's also one of the major greenhouse gases, which unfortunately we're not talking about, and we're just obsessed about carbon. But water accounts for about 75% of the thermodynamics of the planet. Of course it does. It absorbs heat. If you want more information on that, Walter Jennings' work, Jehne, Walter Jennings' work is great. Highly recommend his videos on YouTube. So yeah, I would only put on what is. David, seminar set 2. I'm just going to see if David's currently on here. Yeah, he is. Awesome. So David, I've obviously fallen behind assignments 1, submission deadline due to busy work schedule, offshore for the last 2 weeks. And now that I'm onshore on my off duty, is it still acceptable to submit within 2 to 3 days as I'm in the midst of collecting some data for my project site? It's wet monsoon season here with heavy downpour, thwarting efforts to visit project site. Yeah, no problem, mate. Submit when you're able. If we get super late, like if you're moving on 2, 3, 4 weeks, your feedback from me may be not as much, because I'm working with the classes we're working for, but pretty much without fail, I always go back and give feedback. It's the people who give me 7 assignments at the end of the course that aren't getting total feedback, and rightly so, right? We're moving along with the course as we go. Again, reminder, if you do fall behind, there's options. You can decide not to get a certificate and just go through the material as you do. Of course, the class will finish. You won't be getting feedback from me. You can re-enroll for a small fee, so you can come back at a later date. So just, I would say for anybody who's working on the class, just work at the pace you can, finish what you can. That's really the way to go about it. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the answer.
Thanks so much, David. Cheers. Michael came back with some more questions. Regarding the base map, I've been tracing the satellite images to get the initial layout, but was wondering how exact the measurement should be. Should we go to the site to measure each tree and physical structures such as stairs, garden beds, boulders, fences, etc.? I feel my satellite image is not very accurate based upon, I just started making up words, not very accurate because I have a small site that wasn't sure if it was necessary for future assignments. Okay, cool. So we're going to go to Michael's, and this is important why everybody should to link to their assignment, and they should link to the slide that is most relevant, so I don't have to go searching. Because we only have an hour in these times, it's really important to cut down on the scroll factor and the load factor and all those good things. Okay, so it's based.
If you go to that slide and just copy the link on the top, that goes right to it, right?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly, Jimmy. Okay, so he is urban. So because we're working at a smaller scale, I would say you should be as accurate as possible. So if there are stairs, if there are boulders, if there are things that can't be moved, if there are specific trees, 100%. Yeah, there's no reason not to be as accurate as possible, for sure. And if you can't, if there's something that's not in the satellite photo, you can use triangulation. So basically what that means is you're taking two distances. Let's say there's something in the middle here. You're taking a known fixed point that you can reference on the map and a known fixed point that you can reference on the map. You're getting the distance on one and the distance on the other. So you're getting distance, and then working in scale, you're coming into your map and then you're placing that on your map as well. So there's opportunities there, but I would say urban, yeah, 100%. Be as specific as you can. However, big question, big scope, big answer. Maps need to be as accurate as needed for the intended design. So if I'm doing, I was taking a look at a 6,500 hectare farm the other day, and I'm not worried where boulders are placed at 6,500 acres. I'm taking a look generally at water flow, watershed, things of that nature. I'm generally taking a look at, plant patterns, things like that. So we can sketch out where things should go, like a building, let's say, for energy flow or traffic or sort of real estate. However, once I'm ready to build that building, I'm going to go onto site and I'm going to increase the resolution of where that house is going to go or where that building's going to go, and potentially even survey that area to within sub 5-10 centimeters, because that'll make a difference in terms of pilings or foundations or framing or all of that form work is going to be specific to that site, and that's all going to become a bill of quantities, and that's all going to become a purchase order, and that's all going to become a delivery, all of those things down the line. So generally maps need to be as specific as the site and the objectives that we're trying to make them. So if we are working at scale, if we're 5, 10, 100, 1,000, 200 acres, we always have to scale to a certain level within that. Know that once you have a general map, we'll ground truth planting or installation prep. What happened there? We'll ground truth the planting or installation to prep. So we may have a rough outline of what a planting looks like, but once we get on site, we will then go and do what's called layout. So we'll go out with GPS, we'll go out with line rulers or walking wheels or any of those pieces, and we'll specifically lay everything out. So just know that no plan survives first implementation. And so we'll always go and we'll always be ground truthing. JKB, the tutorial video, he asked for it. There it is. And I showed it to you guys before. Perfect. And I don't think Michael's on. No. Okay, cool. A couple folks in the chat. How do I get to the question, Peg? Got it. Jimmy, do you own your own drone? Yes, I do. So I've used a couple different drones for photogrammetry. I originally used a Phantom 4 DJI, big quadcopter, super stable, just like super great. And I've done a number of surveys that way. I've also added to it because I did a lot of work in British Columbia and Canada, and there was a lot of canopy cover. We then would rent something called a total ground station, RTK, real-time kinetic total ground station, which is basically a system that will work with pretty much every satellite constellation. I think there's one or two that it doesn't. And it'll fix itself in reference to the Earth, find its position within like sub-centimeter accuracy. And then we went around with a receiver. Sometimes we did the receiver on the back of a quad because it helped us to, I think the property was like 350 acres or something. Or we just walked with points and we took points. And then I use an amazing GIS practitioner named Brent Smith of Paper Street Permaculture. He's also a university professor, so he doesn't always have time to do work. And he then blended those two. He blended the photogrammetry from my drone and from the points we took. And I did this as well for Curtis Stone, who's a colleague and friend of mine for his site. And then for Curtis's, we used a Mavic 2, I believe is what he had. And then I'm currently waiting for the API to come out for them to work with the minis, because of course there are issues with drone piloting laws and things of that nature. So yeah, it's.
Do you have an example of like a finished, like what that would look like? Just out of curiosity, I have a Mini 3 Pro. I've been using it for photos.
Yeah.
But I haven't really been able to find something that works to make a map, you know,
Yeah.
holistically that doesn't cost thousands of dollars.
Yeah. So
to have it proof into the software.
So right now the Mini doesn't work with any of
Mhm.
the photogrammetry third-party applications.
Right.
If you borrowed like a Mavic from somebody, you could use Maps Made Easy, and for 50 to $100 in terms of post-processing, you'd be able to get it done. Or a Phantom or any of those other ones. I think they just released the API for the Air, Mavic 1, Mavic 2, Mavic 3, not yet. And I'm a part of a number of photogrammetry drone communities, and there's a question if they'll even release it for the Mini, which is too bad because I picked up a Mini too. Good question. Corey, I have a nearly bare steep sandy slope, and you mentioned in your video feedback that you have advice for this type of slope. In addition, much of my steepest slope has a major knotweed issue. Okay, cool. Let's take a look at your site. Let's see if he's got some information on the base map. Yeah, looks like he's got a bit. It's coming along. Okay, let's go back to the site. Okay, Corey, when you say steep, first and foremost, what's the high point here and what's the low point here and what's the difference?
The high point is between the two houses. That's kind of in the middle of the right there. Yep. And then going east to the right, it's a very steep slope going down to the alleyway. It's kind of an alley.
Okay.
There. And
Like
so
what's the difference between this point and this property boundary in terms of elevation difference?
It's like around 50 feet, I think.
Okay.
It goes down over the course of 40 or 50 feet. So it's
Okay.
it's steeper than like 45 degrees, and it's quite difficult to walk on as well. There's a lot of old bricks. It's a sand dune, so that also creates a major erosion issue. I recently had a professional help start remediating knotweed, which as far as I've looked, there's no real organic way to remediate a major stand of knotweed. I mean, if you have ideas on that, but getting rid of the knotweed also creates erosion issues on the steep slope of the dune. So yeah, one thing I've done is I've started pounding stakes and starting to lay wood along the contour, just and making sure any tree that falls, hopefully ends up on the contour as well. But yeah, if you have any thoughts, I know, one thought is to keep it in permanent forest. One of the issues with that is there's also a power line that does kind of go over the site.
Okay.
So just general thoughts. I mean, we could also let this question evolve and answer it later.
Yeah. And I think we'll have potentials, but as you take a look at what are the objectives for the site in different areas of the site, these may be tools you use specifically. One of the things I really want to caution people against is going through the permaculture store and grabbing something off the shelf and force functioning it into their landscape. This happens a lot where people are like, herb spiral, plunk it, down it goes, or swale, plunk, down it goes. And really, and this is what I think OSU's PDC does really well, is it takes a look at the site as a whole and goes, okay, well, considering what our needs and our wants are, what our sectors, our zones, our microclimates, our desires, where water flow is, what is the application here, what is the implementation that might be useful? So I'm going to describe to you a couple of elements. One is what's called live staking. Now, live staking is a way of taking vegetative matter that is alive, cutting it, and it is usually a pioneer, and it can grow from cutting. So that means you can take a branch of it, make a hole, stick it in the ground, buds up. And if you plant it at a time of year when rain is prolific, it'll have enough rain to set roots. And over time, what'll happen is it'll build up an anchoring or a knitting effect. Now, the gentleman I want to share with you guys who did this brilliantly, desktop 2, was a man by the name of David Polster. Now, David pioneered a lot of his work here by working with the Department of Transportation across Canada. So the Department of Transportation created the Trans-Canada Highway, which is the highway that runs east to west across Canada. And when they were cutting into mountainsides and different areas, they went back to reforest that area with things like wildflowers and conifers. They were trying to basically put the ecology right back in. And what they found was it wasn't working because ecology goes through successional stages. And so instead of starting with pioneers, they were starting with conifers. And what David realized is that if he took these types of pioneers, and these pioneers will be specific to your region, but generally in British Columbia, they were things like alder, which is also a nitrogen fixer, red rose or dogwood, and things like willow. And he was placing them by putting in vertical stakes. So I'm going to do some drawing over top of this so it's clear, and we'll use something like purple or something. It's very clear. So he was putting in vertical stakes, and these would go down 0.5 meter to 1 meter. Again, these are living material that he's cut in mass and brought in. And then he was putting in, and this goes back and forth, behind them, so upslope, he was layering in this material. And he did this back and forth, and then on the next one, it was layered in the opposite direction. Now, keep an eye on those 2 trees. Keep an eye on these 2 trees here. So in short order, what this becomes is it revegetates in short order. It basically knits together that bank. And so you have this change between these 2 where this bank becomes completely and utterly knit. Again, this is a great example in Rogers Pass in '84. And here's that tree on the left, here's that tree on the right. So 34 years after planting, basically a big gravel yard that they were taking gravel and using for different areas within that roadway. You know, how can we deal with erosion without grass and legume seedlings? So create an area that's rough and loose. So where there's pockets of soil, there will be water. Where there's water, there will be seeds. Where there's seeds, there will be vegetation. Where there's vegetation, there will be insects and birds. They bring seeds, and then you have a vegetative process that will come back. This is another spot, which is a great example between the two seasons of growth, because all they did was start to do live staking. This is probably one of the coolest projects I've ever seen. Off of the University of British Columbia, there's slopes that go all the way down to a beach called Wreck Beach. And being on paid lines, they went over to Point Grey Cliffs. You can see that it's a 70% sand slope, anchored in this material, continued to create things called brush mattresses or brush pipes to funnel water to certain areas to move it away from steeper sections. Crazy to think that any section here would not be considered steep. Put blackberries at the top because students would pop down, they would scree with their boots. So screeing is a way of going down a steep slope in boots, and you just ski down it. So they put a whole bunch of nature's barbed wire, blackberry, and there you go. Not a few years later, you start to have full revegetation. 2019, you can see that we have an entire forest that have brought back, and his joke was, you know, this is 2518, you'd be going back to that same forest. So I would say for your site, live staking might be a really appropriate technology depending on precipitable values depending on materials. And usually we go to local riparian areas and we do a major harvest, leaving the vast majority of the trees intact, but taking branches off of them. And then using that as bundle, and then coming in, taking similar sized material. So usually sort of 1/2 inch material is what we're taking 1/2 inch rebar, using that as our hole creator with a post pounder or with a sludge hammer, and then putting that material in and then layering material behind. So I would say for those steeper sections, those sections you're worried about, I think your precognition, your intuition of starting to put in, stakes and material behind was great. This allows for a few things. One, it's vegetative. So now we're starting to create organic matter and material and living soil in it. But two, and this is important for everybody, if they're looking at a steep section and they're looking at erosion, you want to be able to catch some of the soil in solution that's being washed away. And this is a great way of doing it, because what happens is if you have a slope and you have this kind of mini terrace, you get an accumulation of material behind that. So you get these little steps. And again, where you have area where soil can stop, you'll have collection of soil, you have collection of water. Where there's soil and water, that's collection. You'll have seed. Where there's seed, there'll be vegetation. Where there's vegetation, there's ecology. So you're basically stopping that erosive potential, because at some point this area was denuded from trees, thrown up some houses, something happened along that range, and now we're getting very sandy soil. So there has to be a way to correct that behavior. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay, sounds good. And then I feel like there was a two-parter on that question. I want to make sure I got the other side. Oh, knotweed. So the other cool thing about this is that if you start to create a forest that shades out the ground, knotweed levels drop dramatically, because they're a pioneer, because they need open sun. They don't usually survive in deep shade. It's the same thing with broom. Everybody's, they lose their minds over Scotch broom, Japanese broom, you name it. They don't like broom. But the moment you get into larger and larger and larger and larger forests, it's not a problem. So I would say try to work at it from an ecology succession position, build up the ecology around it, and then see how that changes. It's like the knotweed in many ways is trying to knit that landscape that's falling apart. Like it's doing a great job of it. We had the same problem with Himalayan blackberry, which everyone calls invasive, but at the same time, we mostly find it in places that are erosive, and it's trying to knit that landscape. So we have to take a look at a so-called negative, and we have to remove our glasses of racism. And that's all calling a weed invasive or calling a plant invasive, or calling a plant a weed is. It's the lenses of racism, but it's on plants, because the plants, they're doing a job. And it's our job to come in and go, what's the functionality of this plant? That's not to say that there aren't advantageous plants and they come in and they take over native habitat, and there's all of that. That's true. I'm not debating that. But at the same time, we have to ask the question, what is currently not being achieved in this place? And this is what's funny about Scotch broom, is Scotch broom is a nitrogen fixer, and people will rip out the Scotch broom, but they won't put back in a nitrogen fixer. Not to mention it's narcotic. It's the only time in Seattle when road rage drop is when the Scotch broom blooms. So there's all of these amazing different elements. And if you're somebody who subscribes to James Lovelock Gaia theory, I can imagine that Scotch broom was attracted to Seattle because of its narcotic bloom effect. But yeah. Winard has a great point. Vetiver is a great plant for erosion control. Yeah, in Indiana, it's not going to be a great choice, but definitely in tropics, it's a good piece there. Deb was saying that she lives in Rec, at residence over Rec Beats. That's awesome. And Marianne, we have a place here at the Arboretum that got compacted after a tornado knocked down a lot of old growth. The heavy machinery compacted the soil. Currently, we're layering a couple of feet deep of wood chips. With succession planting, 100%, not to mention mechanical decompaction at the beginning of a project is not a problem. So think of everything we talk about as a tool. Now, if you use the same tool over and over and over again in every single situation, plowing, chances are you're going to come up against a screw when you're all of a sudden you're using a hammer. It's not the right tool for the job, but that doesn't mean that plowing can't be useful. I had a project in Kelowna, and they were dealing, it could have been knotweed. I think it might have been Japanese knotweed. It could have been something else. But basically, they needed to drop the load of this invasive so that way they could start their project. Plowing, raking, and fluffing for, I think the course of treatment was 2 or 3 weeks, we decided, was a great idea. It removed the rhizomes as much as possible, because basically when you plow, there's an effect, I forget what it's called, but it's the same effect of why in an avalanche, they're moving towards these big inflatable things. So you're the biggest thing in the avalanche, so you come to the top. It's the same thing when you have like mixed nuts and you shake them. You've got the macadamians and the big ones that come to top, something to do with surface area. I forget the name of it. But you can do this with soil. And so basically if you plow and rake and fluff, the rhizomes will actually come to the surface, and you can rake them to the side, and you can solarize them with tarps, which helps them to decompose and stops them from spreading. You could do this 2 or 3 times. Now you have to realize from a process standpoint, that drops the soil food web in that soil precipitously. You have to go back in knowing, okay, I've got to rehabilitate the soil because I've really removed the vegetative capacity for the soil and the interaction. So yeah, it's a great point that you make, Marianne. Like when there's compaction, I like going back in and plowing. Now, when I plow, I usually use something called a chisel plow, a shear plow, or as P.A. Yeoman called it, a keyline plow. And this is a plow that looks like a fighter jet. And basically it shears soil by lifting it, but it doesn't invert it. So you have vertical shafts that basically cut through the soil, lifting it. And this is what PA did for years with his yeoman's plow, plowing on a key line geometry, which is basically going from the valleys to the ridges down slopes. So that way water that intercepts these ridges, or plants that intercept these ridges, these ridge tines, pardon me, slowly move down slope. And we can get into that in another conversation. It's a little bit early to do a deep dive into keyline, but basically shear plows allow non-inversion. Non-inversion allows for the soil food web to largely stay intact. And those are great to start off a site. So if, you know, depending on what that compaction is, and you can let us know in the questions there, if it was very deep compaction, I might be considering decompaction, mechanical decompaction first and foremost, and then going in and doing some different types of planting. This idea of constantly layering wood chips, which is great. You know, the back to Eden method is a great idea. It doesn't really ameliorate deep compaction, because the bioturbation of earthworms, let's say, they can go deep, but if there's no reason to go deep, they won't. You know, you have to think like the earthworm. You have to think like the animals and the vegetation you're working with. If there's no food down there, why would they go down there? But if you mechanically decompact with shear plows or chisel plows, and then you immediately plant in deep-rooted early pioneer grasses or forbs or trees, well, now there's a reason for that biology to get down into the soil. But if you don't have that reason, why would they go there? So if there is compaction, I think it'd be important. And she just put on there that no one's measured it. Well, that would be one of those first studies I would do, those first observations. Okay, we are at 1. There's still a ton of questions. What I'm going to say is let's cap questions. So if you do have another question, put it into October 31st. I'm going to go late and answer the rest of the questions. If you have to go, it was a pleasure to see you. Again, if you have any questions or comments about what's going on with your assignments, feel free to reach out. If you need technical assistance, I can be reached, or you can reach out to Dow or Devin. There's a whole thread within the Canvas ecosystem there that you can reach out. But don't spend time being stuck. It's not necessary. Just reach out. And if it's a big issue, we can always meet via Zoom in a short question. So. Woder, my site is very long and narrow. It's difficult to see all the time. Would it be fine? Yeah, absolutely. So I answered this above. Callouts is totally fine. And Ben already asked, so I will try and look through and find a couple examples of that. Related to a previous question, I'm not using an aerial drone photograph for my base map because the satellite image from Google Earth are not great. I'm using an aerial drone. Since you want north to be up, should I just try and rotate the image so that it's more or less orientated correctly? Yeah, Woder, if you could just throw a link to your assignment here, I'm going to answer the next question and I'll come back to it. yeah, throw your link up there and then I'll take a look at it. And then I can be able to do that. Sheena Eden, I was able to find the sketch software program mentioned in the iPad tutorial. Does it have a new name? Yeah, so it's called Morpholio Trace is the one I use. I like it. It's very good. I also use Procreate and I also use Concepts. And if somebody could just, actually I can do that. That's fine. So we have Morpholio Trace and we have Concepts and we have Procreate. And then again, these are all for iPad. If you're on Android, I don't have any suggestions because I don't use it. And then the one thing I was going to say is that I think we've got the previous office hours up here. So you can always look to the previous office hours. Intro to iPad design was one I did, and I went into deep conversation about it. And there might have been one more I remember. And if any of these topics are interesting to you, keyline, GIS, things like that, there's a whole bunch of previous Q&As that we've done.
Is there a place with all the slide tutorials, or are they only on each page of the Google Slide document?
They're only on each page of the Google Slides. So Woder, I just want to check and see if you're here. Yeah, Woder is here. Woder, can you put your link up here so I can come back to it and we can take a look at that? Sheena, go ahead.
I just put in chat. I don't have an assignment.
Oh,
yet.
in chat. Gotcha. I'll take a look at the there. Oh, I have no assignment yet. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that correctly without actually seeing your base map or seeing your design site. You submitted a design site assignment, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
Okay,
but
can you?
It doesn't have the aerial photograph.
Oh, okay.
I used Google Earth for the site assignment.
Yeah,
and
that's fine.
For the,
that's fine. Could you link your portfolio, please?
well, I'm saying for the base map, I'm using an aerial photograph.
Yeah, but if I can take a look at the aerial, I can give you an answer to your question, because without seeing it, I don't know.
Okay, I can't do it now then, sorry.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, generally, just rotate the image so it's more or less oriented correctly. Yeah, I would go with north as being up. If you think it's going to be a certain way, or if it's going to be better the other way, yeah, just go with your intuition. I can always comment on it when you submit. Sheena, does that answer your question in terms of what the programs were?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, awesome. Then we've got this. So this is an action for Javin. I'll take a look at that afterwards. Marianne, oh yeah, you asked me this question in your assignment. I gave it to you in your feedback, but I'm having a lot of frustration with Google Slides for my base map. I'm moving it over to Affinity Designer so I can do layers to organize, which I'm more familiar with. Are you able to do any layers with Google Slides? No. Or PowerPoint? No. Or are there other apps that people like to use? Yeah. So a fair number of people really enjoy Daniel Housley's United Designers approach, and he uses the Adobe suite for folks that are okay with their predatory subscription-based pricing. I'm not, so do as you will. I design pretty much solely with Google Earth Pro and with Morpholio Trace these days, but I am experimenting with Concepts. But Affinity Designer is a great one-time price, usually a lower price point. That would be a great example. A couple of folks have used things like Inkscape and have used SketchUp, Google SketchUp. There was a student in my previous class who loves SketchUp, and I tried SketchUp years ago, but I felt and found that I really wanted to have my hand involved with it in drawing. So I'll probably continually stay with drawing applications because it's more enjoyable. Does that answer your question, Marianne?
Yep. Thank you for your help.
No worries. Sounds good.
All
Let
right.
me know how it goes.
Okay. All right. Okay. Bye.
Deb, I'm working on a former drive-in movie theater. Awesome. Super compacted areas of soil along with a very heavy clay. I've been letting the area with most compaction go wild. However, the one plant that gives me most concern is growing in the lazy is crazy is wild parsnip. My town has mandated that I eliminate it. I've been managing it by cutting it before it goes to seed or other options to outcompete this undesirable plant. Okay, so again, let's pull back. There's always going to be the plant that people are going to hate. It's kind of a crazy way to go through life. It's a great way to be at war with something and have a job. Go outside the door and dislike something, and then you have a job for life. But if we pull back, what's that parsnip trying to do? So generally, parsnips are trying to decompact soil. And it's something I'll do in new places. I will throw parsnip seeds if I'm trying to decompact an area. Why? Because they become these little worm hotels if you leave them in the ground. They decompose, they turn into carbohydrates, they turn into sugar. The worms love me. I'm sure they've got banners and they're going, yay, Javin. But generally what they're doing is they're decompacting that area, and it's great. So couple of ideas, couple of options. You could, if you're going to stay there for a long time, if it's going to be a feet first property, this is a term that a client long ago introduced to me. When I asked her, how long are you going to stay on the property? She said, well, it's feet first. I was like, what do you mean? I will be taken from this property feet first, dead in a box. I'm like, okay. So if it's a property that has your heart, your mind, your soul in it, you may want to go down the row of, I'm going to be in an educational role to educate individuals around me to make them realize that this is a non-natural occurring soil disturbance, highly compacted, highly compacted, okay? Highly compacted. This highly compacted soil, unnaturally so, tons and tons and tons of cars that have been driven on it, not to mention when it was laid down and probably compacted, needs to be broken up. Well, here's a plant that's doing it. And at the same time, it's producing organic matter, because this was probably a very low organic matter soil, dirt, aggregate, substrate. So what I might do if I was up for the challenge, and again, we have to decide if we're up for the challenge. If we're not, we're not, which means you do something else. But what I might do is I might go the educational route, explain the process, explain the conversation, and then say, well, what I want to do is I want to transition this from what is to this. And this may be a forest, this may be a food forest, this may be a planting, this may be a pollinator garden, whatever your designs are, whatever it might be. Well, you then describe and discuss that it's the successional process, and it's currently in a pioneer process, and the local ecology is throwing the tool that can do the job. And sure enough, it's wild parsnip. Of course it is. And it's trying to decompact, it's trying to create organic matter as quickly as possible. There's a joke, and we've said this many times. It's like, if we were given a gravel pit, what plant would we use to rehabilitate it? And we've said it many times, we'd use Scotch broom, to the horror and aghast and fainting of many people. But when you take a look at a place that has been removed of topsoil, removed of A and B, and now it's down to parent, you need a plant that will look at the gravel and go, it looks like a good place to stay. So you need to be using those plants that have that functionality. And over time, you can succeed out of broom. Of course, their argument is you're going to produce so much seed, and that seed's going to travel and all the rest of it. And they're not wrong. But at the same time, what other tool in our toolbox do we have to work with? And I think live staking is a great example in places that do have precipitable values that would support it. It doesn't support in all areas. And again, good point to make. Not all of the tools and suggestions I'm giving here are a panacea for every single biome, every single place in the world. It's just not, they're not always going to be the right tool. So, if there's a suggestion made and you're like, that makes sense until I consider this thing about my site, that could be the thing that negates this attribute. And that's really important to really specifically select. So let's say you can't go that route. Let's say that you have to suggest something else. Plant parsnip. Instead of doing wild parsnip, just use parsnip.
I did. So I heavily seeded with conventional non-wild parsnip to see how that works. But the wild parsnip is doing an awesome job. So I'm like trying to figure out how to argue against being fined for something that the neighbors, I'm in a farming community. And so I'm getting the argument that it's going to kill people's cows. And
Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. So the moderation of that would be, you know, doing what you're doing, deadheading or cutting it out, and then supplanting with parsnip, daikon radish, you know, any other of your decompactors. What are their thoughts about dandelion?
Oh, I love dandelion. I don't know about them.
You know, and so it may be finding the crossover, the Venn diagram of what will decompact and work in the site and what they don't terribly are worried about will affect their livelihood, which is understandable. That's an understandable frustration and complaint. So I would say working that way. And the other thing is potentially coming into the site and working with mechanical decompaction. And the thing with mechanical decompaction is you'll have to start shallow, like an inch or half an inch to drag through, but dragging, applying seed, doing it at the proper time of year. So that way there is some precipitation to support growth, and then coming at it the next year and the next year, you'll find that that tine will go deeper and deeper and deeper, and over time it will remediate. But yeah, you're right, it takes time. Great question. Okay, we got another chat. Oh, Woder did add his link. Awesome. Bum, ba-dum, ba-ba-dum, bum, bum. Oh yeah. Okay. So your question, Woder, is should you keep this like this, or should you augment it so it more works with the square of the slide? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the photograph was taken along the length of the property, so it's top down. So that's how I'm seeing it. So if I were to you know, use some type of image editing program, I would have to then rotate it to look like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, if it were me, and you know, I've worked in the Southern Hemisphere, I would leave it with a north-south axis here. And what I would do is I'd probably make this as big as possible on my screen. So I'm going to use red to mimic your let's go here, to mimic your property boundary. So I'd probably go like as big as I could, going, you know, point to point, to make this as big as possible. And then I would probably go in and I would have little call outs or little details. So I would have, you know, an area around the house. I'd probably have an overlap of this area, you know, maybe an overlap here all the way down, or maybe half here and half here. And you can either do it in squares like this, and so that way you end up with little crosses. So you've got something like this as a section, this as a section, this is a section, something like that. Or you can just do it in that same vantage point. So in this case, let's say you had the house here, you would have a master base map that would be large, and then you'd have something that you could scale up. So that way, if you were taking, let's say, the base map here, you could, you know, make it something like, where's the bottom of the slide there? Yeah, something like this. So that way it would be nice and big. So that way, you know, the house would be here, and then you'd have that garden behind you. And that way you could have these call outs to focus on those different areas. I'd probably do it that way.
Okay, but I mean, basically I can use just the aerial image to kind of create my own trace and not have to rely on the satellite images.
Yeah, I think it's fine. I think this is a fine image to use. You could open up Google Earth Pro on desktop and then cycle back through the dates to see if there's a clearer photo or one that gives you more detail. But you know, this seems fine enough to start with.
No, I've been through them. This is the best photograph I could find, which is quite a few years old.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would say go with it then, and then just make augments as you need to, or if there's something new, and just make sure it's on the map.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much. Cool. I'm going to move Ben's down so I remember. And we're going to make that heading 3 so I remember. Perfect. Corey, do you have a link for the David Polster work you shed? No. These are screenshots taken at his retirement party. And I could reach out to his wife. Unfortunately, one of the reasons he retired was he has dementia. And so unfortunately, he's no longer he's no longer teaching. And I reached out to them to help them design a course to share his work. But as a close second, there's a book up here, Living on the Edge, David Polster, and you can reach out to his wife if you want to purchase the book. Great book, really appreciate it. She also has a digital copy she can send you, and all funds from this go to Dave's continued care and retirement. So yeah, there's that. I'd love to say that I could share some of the materials I have from them, but yeah, they're currently not for sharing. Besides these moments where I get to share them publicly like this and show folks them. So if that ever changes, I'll let you know. I'm going to check the chat here. Daniel, hey Daniel, I really enjoy these Q&A sessions. Well, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate that. That's very kind of you. Okay, one last question that Jimmy threw down. How do you deal with scale on drone shots? What do you mean?
I just mean, like, so Google Maps has the built-in scale if you go to Google Earth and zoom in. But if you take a photo for a call out using the mini, how are you going to deal with scale? I guess I know there's like, you could put a reference line down that's 1 meter before you take the photo, but without physically doing that, do we need a scale for each individual photo since it'll change based on like how it's zoomed in?
Yeah, so I would say if you have, and I'll just get you to mute yourself because I'm hearing myself. I would say if you're taking a drone of a property that has buildings on it, measure the buildings, and now you have something measurable that you can then interpolate and create out a scale. If you don't, then your other suggestion is good as well, which is probably taking, at scale, probably 10 meters would be the minimum, just so that way you've got a large enough scale. And so, paste that off, walk that off, take a tape line, point to point, make sure you can reference it on the image. And now you have a scale that you can then transfer digitally onto some kind of base map. Great question. Awesome. All right, folks, well done. Made it to the end of a special close to 80-minute Q&A. We don't usually go this long, but if there's questions, I like to keep going. Great questions, really great questions for session 2. Definitely shows the caliber and quality of what you're thinking about, how you're going about it. Continue with these questions. I so appreciate the interaction, the conversation. As we're going throughout the course, again, because we're getting into winter months, do take a look ahead, take a look at the soil assignment, take a look at the veg ID, vegetation ID. If you have the opportunity, if this is fall season for you and you're in the north hemisphere, go outside when it's raining, take a look at where the water's flowing, get a sense of that. That'll be really important before snow flies. That all gives you a lot of good information about designing your site. So highly recommend that. And as I've said many times, have fun. As you have fun and enjoy the process and enjoy playing with the process, you'll find that learning is a lot easier. If you hold on too tightly to, am I getting the concept? Is this right? It'll guaranteed to be wrong. So we're all going to come out of a site and see something differently. There's no perfect design. I'm not going to take a look at a site and my colleagues aren't going to take a look at the site and make the same design. And that's the cool thing about having a multitude of people take a look at your design. And this is why this course is so important, is because you have a lot of people looking at your design, making suggestions, making commentary. I make commentary from my experience. And the great thing is you get to respond to me and go, I don't know if you're right. And I may not be, because we are looking at this from different vantage points. And this is why playing with your design, sketching your design out multiple times. And if you have an idea or a thought that comes up as you're going through one of our observational assignments, because we don't get to design until like assignment 17 or 16 or whatever it is, jot it down, and if you want to pass it by me during an office hour so we can do some live design, if you want to send it to me, that's fine. I'd be happy to take a look at those things. Just remember that I need context, and hopefully that's come across here. I can't answer a question without context or the site link or anything like that. I need to be able to see these things to give you information. But yeah, have as much fun as you can. And if you're stuck, reach out for help. Continue to reply to comments and queries from your classmates and myself. And thanks so much, Emily. yeah, you're most welcome. It's super fun to sit with you folks every other week and share some thoughts. So with that, got some claps happening. That's super nice. All right. Thanks, everybody. We will see you in 2 weeks' time. If you have any questions, comments, queries, feel free to reach out. Thanks for all the things, guys. And have a good time. See you soon.